Middleway Philosophy Introductory Video 4B Avoiding Discontinuity by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 4 on incrementality. The problem of discontinuity is created by the ways in which our left and right brains tend to work. The left brain, focusing on goals and beliefs we have that form the background to those goals, is discontinuous. That's because either we have certain goals or we change those goals to other goals, or we believe certain things to be the case or we don't. We believe them to be true or false. The right brain, on the other hand, focuses on experience and allows experience to reach the left brain. So the right brain works in a continuous fashion just because our experience is continuous. There are no sudden jumps or gaps in that continuity in conceptual terms. We need the left brain's decisive discontinuity as the price of action, because in practice, when we do anything, we have to assume that a certain situation is true or that other things are false. For example, if you eat your lunch, you need to assume that your lunch really exists and that your lunch isn't poisonous. You also need to assume it's false that there's any immediate threat that would stop you doing so. Your house isn't just about to collapse. There isn't a tiger about to spring on you. In that set of assumptions about that state of affairs, you can happily complete what you're doing. Though necessary, that practical discontinuity interferes with the adequacy of our judgments. To see how this works more clearly, it's helpful to distinguish three kinds of discontinuity. Firstly, there's the discontinuity of conditions. That is, things that affect us from beyond our experience that appear to be discontinuous. Next, there's provisional discontinuity. That's discontinuity that it's necessary for us to make in order to act. Thirdly, there's absolutizing discontinuity. That's the kind of discontinuity that we don't necessarily have to make and that interferes unnecessarily with our judgment. A good example of discontinuity of conditions is death. Death, it seems, happens in most cases quite suddenly. It's quite a well-defined process, at least medically speaking. There's a moment when you're alive, when your brain is still functioning, and then there's a moment after brain death when you're no longer alive. Nevertheless, if you look more closely, that apparent discontinuity is actually an increment. It just takes place relatively quickly. Death is, after all, a process, even if it has a moment of intensity when the key change takes place. This is not anything to do with discontinuity of judgment. It's just something we have to work with. And it's worth noting, though, that we do find such discontinuity difficult, especially when it happens suddenly. That's, of course, why we need funerals, why we have rites of passage generally, to help us to come to terms with discontinuities in our experience as human beings. Provisional discontinuity, though, is where we do make a discontinuous judgment for practical reasons, which, of course, are then fixed in the sense that we can't do anything about what we've already decided. However, the basis of that judgment, when it comes to future decisions, can still be changed. So, for example, if somebody made a certain kind of practical proposal, but you found it necessary in the certain circumstances to reject that proposal, but they made it later and the circumstances had changed slightly, you might change your mind. There's nothing intrinsic about that person or the fact that they're making the proposal which means that you have to reject it. There's still some flexibility about your response. There are options, there are alternatives of the kind that are discussed in the provisionality series of videos. Absolutizing discontinuity, on the other hand, is an unnecessary kind of discontinuity in judgment. There's a concept at work in that judgment which you could have treated incrementally, but you choose in some way, or you judge that it should be treated discontinuously. That there should be a yawning great gap, a division in that concept or in the objects that you're dealing with. Here are some examples of absolutizing discontinuity. We'll start with race. Any kind of genetic differences between human beings are, of course, incremental. They're a matter of differences in genes, and there are a great many genes which interact in extremely complex ways. That complexity is simplified into clear racial boundaries for racist purposes of various kinds. That's an example of an absolutizing discontinuity. So, for example, the boundary between black and white, particularly as continued by the one-drop rule in American culture, traditional culture in the South, absolutizes that division between two races. Of course, that absolutization is then an aid to the political exploitation of that division between the two groups. Geographical boundaries of any kind, between properties or particularly between nations, are another example of absolutizing discontinuity. The boundaries between nations are absolutizations imposed conceptually on an increment of differences, whether those differences are geographical, cultural, linguistic, political, religious, whatever the various bases of the differences between nations are. The difficulties created by that absolutization are well known in political terms. You can particularly see them in boundary disputes between nations, but also more recently particularly with the question of migration. Time is another example of absolutizing discontinuity, because we divide the temporal flow up into hours, minutes and seconds, which are discontinuous. They're imposed by the left hemisphere on the experience of temporal change, which comes into the right hemisphere. So experiences like those of boredom or impatience are a matter of absolutizing discontinuity imposed on the process of time as we experience it. The distinction between any kind of expert or specialist and ordinary people is another kind of potentially absolutizing discontinuity, especially where this involves rigid limitations on what can be achieved, particularly by the ordinary people who are ruled out, unable to gain any degree of expertise. A good example of this is found in the Buddhist tradition, in the distinction between monks and lay people, which become in effect first and second class Buddhists. Particularly in the Theravada tradition, the monks are able to gain enlightenment, but the lay people traditionally are not. Political power can also involve absolutizing discontinuity, especially again where the political authorities have power but ordinary people don't have any degree of power. That opens the gates particularly to the abuse of power by those who have it, and obviously the disempowerment of the ordinary citizens. Gender roles are another common example of absolutizing discontinuity. The incremental differences between masculine and feminine types of equality are absolutized, so that those who are female entirely possess the feminine ones, and those who are masculine entirely present the masculine ones. But it's the effect on morality that's probably the most basic and damaging form of absolutizing discontinuity. When we see there to be good and evil, and we readily place things in our experience in those two categories, then we're failing to apply the incrementality, which is the only adequate way of really applying ethical judgment to the world around us. So rather than good and evil, in absolute terms, we need to think in terms of perhaps good and better, or if you're feeling particularly pessimistic, then evil and worse. There's a close relationship between the avoidance of discontinuity and our ability to consider alternatives, as discussed in the provisionality video in this series and its tributaries. So if we can see the qualities of a particular object, say, as, well, perhaps mainly one particular kind, but still involving a degree of another, then this incremental model allows us to think in terms of two qualities, two alternatives, rather than simply monolithically in terms of one quality. It's that ability to consider alternatives, alternative qualities, that can help us to overcome the kind of conflicts that are created by discontinuity. So, for example, if you think that somebody else hates you, then you're attributing just a single monolithic quality to that person, and you're much more likely to have a negative response to them. But if you can consider that maybe they have a degree of hatred for you, but that at other times, to a degree, they have other feelings, then you're beginning to recognize a complex situation which may enable you to build a resolution. The resolution of conflict often involves the breaking down of discontinuities that people are imposing on the situation, red lines that they stand behind and defend and won't compromise on. That at the same time involves the recognition of alternatives, that there may be other ways of conceiving the situation. So, to summarize, discontinuity is created by left brain dominant assumptions. Those assumptions need to be integrated through the help of enough awareness of the right hemisphere, or at least avoiding a degree of overdominance by the left. Some relative discontinuity is found in conditions, as in the example of death. That's not the kind of problematic discontinuity we're talking about here. Some unavoidable discontinuity is necessary for action, but we can try and minimize that through the kind of reflection we employ before action, as far as the circumstances permit. Absolutizing discontinuity imposes a conceptual boundary between two concepts, which is then applied dogmatically in action. Absolutizing discontinuity creates conflict, whether we're talking about internal conflict in a person or social or political conflict. And that can be resolved, though, by the practice of incrementality.